The first thing I heard when I came out of sedation was my wife saying, "No, don't tell him yet. He can't handle stress right now." She was standing just outside the curtain, close enough that I could see the shape of her shoes under the gap, and she said it in that soft, organized voice she used when she wanted nurses to think she was the reasonable one in a room. A man answered her. Low voice, not a doctor. "The claim has already paid. If he contacts the insurer before we sort the probate issue, it gets messy." Probate. I remember staring at the white rail of the hospital bed and trying to understand how a word like probate had entered a conversation about my broken spine while I was still attached to a catheter bag and a chest monitor. Then my wife, Talia, said, "He was declared non-responsive for 2 days. My brother acted on what we were told. We're trying to fix it." Fix what? I tried to speak and made a dry choking sound instead. The curtain moved. Talia was in front of me a second later, tears already ready, hand on my forehead. Hey, baby, don't push. You're okay." I wasn't okay. My left leg was strapped. My ribs felt wired together with knives, and I had just heard my wife discuss an insurance payout and probate like I was a delayed inconvenience. A nurse came in and checked my vitals while Talia stroked my hair. She looked perfect. Mascara intact, nails done. Same cream cardigan she wore to parent-teacher nights when she wanted to look warm and competent. I couldn't ask the question properly. I could barely get air. I said, "Probate?" Talia blinked once, then smiled like she was calming a confused child. "You're groggy. Don't worry about anything. Just focus on healing." That answer was my first proof item. And nobody treated it like one, because it was only a word in a hospital room. But that word sat in my head harder than the pain meds. I was in ICU for 3 more days, then high dependency, then a trauma ward room with a window facing a brick wall and an air conditioning unit that rattled all night. I had a fractured pelvis, 3 broken ribs, a collapsed lung that had been reinflated, a concussion, and a mess of soft tissue injuries from getting T-boned by a delivery truck that ran a red light. At least that was the medical version. The financial version turned out to be stranger. By day 6, my phone was returned to me in a clear plastic bag with my wallet, keys, and a cracked screen protector. Talia said she had handled everything, which in our marriage usually meant bills had been paid late, but explained convincingly. I asked for my phone anyway. She hesitated just long enough for me to notice. "You really should rest." "Phone." She handed it over, smiling. But she stayed in the room while I turned it on. That was mistake number 1 on her side. If she'd left, she could have prepared. Instead, I watched her face while my notifications came in. 43 missed calls, 200 and something messages. Work, my sister, neighbors, unknown numbers. 3 emails from my bank marked urgent. 2 from my life insurer with subject lines that included the words claim determination and benefit disbursement. I looked up at Talia. She didn't blink. "I was going to tell you when you were stronger." The room went quiet except for the monitor. I opened the insurer email. It was not a scam. It was formal, complete, and addressed to Estate of Daniel Kareem Hassan. My full name, my policy number, a condolence line. Confirmation that a claim under my life policy had been assessed and paid to the nominated beneficiary following notification of death, supported by hospital documentation and registry advice pending final certification. Pending final certification. I read that line 3 times because my hands were shaking and the morphine made the words slide if I looked too fast. I was alive in a hospital bed reading an email confirming payment of my death benefit to my nominated beneficiary. Talia started talking immediately, too quickly. "The hospital told us your prognosis was very poor and there was confusion and everyone thought, who filed it?" No answer. "Who filed the claim?" She folded her arms, defensive now. "My brother helped me because I was in shock." Her brother, Nabil. He sold used cars, called himself a business consultant, and had been between opportunities for most of the 10 years I'd known him. He also knew just enough paperwork language to sound legitimate to people under pressure. I opened the second insurer email. Payment amount redacted in the preview. I clicked. Full amount visible, $850,000. That was the policy I took out after our second child was born when I started doing more highway work and realized I'm careful is not a financial plan. I kept the premiums current even when I skipped new clothes for myself. I knew that amount because I built our entire risk planning around it. I looked at Talia and asked the only question that mattered in that moment. "Where is it?" She took half a second too long and said, "Safe." That half second changed the room. If the money had been sitting untouched in her account because she thought I was dying, she would have said, "In my account." If she'd panicked and moved it to savings, she would have said, "Transferred, but I can show you." Safe is what people say when money has started moving. I hit call on the insurer email signature while she was still standing there. Now she reached for the phone. "Daniel, don't do this right now." I turned my shoulder, and the pain lit up my ribs so hard I saw white spots, but I kept the phone. The call went to a claims line, then a queue. Hospital signal was bad. I got a woman named Priya who spoke clearly and slowly and asked security questions I could answer. When I told her I was the policyholder and I was currently alive in St. Vincent's trauma ward, she stopped typing for long enough that I could hear the hold music kick in and mute again. "Mr. Hassan," she said, "I need to escalate this immediately." Talia left the room during that sentence. I watched her go and knew, before any investigation started, that whatever happened next was going to cost me my marriage, my peace, or both. The insurer froze any further activity on the claim while they reviewed the file. That sounded good until I learned what freeze meant in practice. It did not reverse the payout. It meant no more changes, no beneficiary updates, no internal closure, and an immediate fraud/compliance review. The money, Priya said carefully, had already been disbursed to the beneficiary account on record. Beneficiary account on record was Talia. By that afternoon, I had 2 calls from insurer compliance, 1 call from a hospital administrator, and 1 call from a police officer who wanted to know whether I was alleging intentional fraud or administrative error. I said I was alleging nothing yet because I was lying in a hospital bed with drains and staples and did not have the file. That answer mattered later. People think strategy starts when you get angry. It starts when you refuse to overstate facts before you can prove them. My anchor through that first week was my younger sister, Miriam. She lived 40 minutes away, worked nights as a radiology tech, and had the kind of steady face that made people confess more than they planned. She arrived with a phone charger, track pants, and a notebook before Talia came back. I showed her the emails. She sat very still, then asked, "Did you change beneficiaries recently?" "No." "Did you sign anything before the accident?" "No." "Did Talia have access to your insurer login? Maybe saved on the laptop, I don't know." She nodded and opened the notebook. "Start with sequence. We can be angry later." That line kept me from doing something stupid 10 different times. By evening, Talia returned with Nabil. He walked into my room like he was arriving to fix a delayed shipment. Hands open, calm smile, expensive watch he definitely couldn't afford from legitimate commissions. "Dan, man, thank God," he said. "Miscommunication, that's all. Everybody thought the worst." I was in too much pain to sit up fully, but I didn't need to. "Did you file a death claim while I was alive?" He put a hand on his chest like I'd insulted him unfairly. "I helped your wife navigate paperwork while doctors were saying things looked critical." "That's not what I asked," Talia cut in. "Daniel, please. The children are terrified. We need to be united." Our children were with her mother. She was using them as a pressure blanket. Miriam, who had been standing near the window, spoke for the first time. "Where's the payout?" Nabil smiled at her, not kindly. "This is between spouses." Miriam said, "Not if there's fraud exposure and an insurer review." He looked at her differently after that, like he'd just realized there was a witness in the room who spoke process. He switched tactics. Funds were used for immediate obligations because everyone believed Daniel wasn't coming back to work for a long time, if at all. Hospital costs, mortgage protection, school fees, nothing was stolen. Used. There it was. I said, "How much is left?" He glanced at Talia. She looked at the floor. That was the first public denial/removal moment in my own life that happened in front of hospital staff. Yeah, because the nurse walked in halfway through that exchange and stopped when she felt the room. "Is everything okay here?" she asked. No one answered. She looked at me. I said, "Can I have visitors limited to my sister for now?" Talia turned to me like I'd slapped her. "Daniel," the nurse asked calmly, "are you requesting that your wife and this visitor leave?" I said yes. Nabil started arguing immediately. Family stress, misunderstanding, cruel timing, but the nurse called security without raising her voice. I watched my wife get walked out of my trauma ward room while telling me she loved me and I was making a mistake. I believed she might love me in whatever way she understood love. I also believed money had moved in ways she could not explain cleanly. Both things can be true. Only one of them mattered to compliance. The next 48 hours were paperwork and pain. I signed a privacy request with the hospital to obtain all records around the period I was listed non-responsive, including any communications issued about my status. And I signed insurer authorization for direct contact with compliance and internal audit. I signed a limited authority allowing Miriam to receive updates because I could barely stay awake for full calls. The hospital administrator, a tired man named Ross with a striped tie and the expression of someone who had spent years cleaning up systems messes, came to my room with a file and an apology that was careful enough to be legal. "There appears to have been an erroneous internal status entry," he said. "A critical incident during transfer generated a deceased flag in one linked system before it was corrected. We are reviewing how external parties may have received or relied upon that information." "Who did you tell I was dead?" He exhaled. "We are still determining what was communicated, by whom, and in what form." That was administrator language, for we know something went wrong, but we're not saying it broadly yet. And I asked for it in writing. He blinked, then nodded. "I can provide a summary of the review process and your request for records." More. Ignored proof item number 2 arrived that same evening in a way almost too small to notice. One of the night nurses, Sophia, handed Miriam a transparent hospital property pouch and said, "This was in your brother's belongings, but got stored separately after ICU transfer. Inside was my work phone. I had completely forgotten I carried 2 phones, personal and company issued. The work phone battery was dead and the screen corner was chipped, but once charged it contained messages from the afternoon of the accident, including a text from Talia at 4:17 p.m. to my work number asking, 'Can you send me the insurance login code if they text you? Urgent.' I had not seen it because at 4:17 p.m. I was on a road, upside down in a crushed ute, with paramedics cutting the door. At 4:18 p.m., there was an automated SMS from my insurer to my work phone. 'Your verification code is 6 hash marks. Do not share this code.' I had not opened it. The code still appeared in the notification history. At 4:23 p.m., another message from Talia. 'NVM got in.' I stared at the screen until the numbers blurred. That sequence meant she had attempted to access the insurer portal within minutes of the accident before any family member could plausibly say they were handling a death claim in shock days later. I still didn't know how she got in. Saved password, password reset, guessed security questions, but the timing destroyed the "we thought you were gone, so we filed later" version. Miriam photographed the screen with her own phone, then emailed the images to herself, me, and a new Gmail account we created solely for evidence backup. "Don't keep originals in one place," she said. "Phones die." That night, in a room lit by a monitor and the corridor nightlight, we started the first real evidence log. Time, source, what it appears to show, who witnessed it. While where backup stored. This is the part people skip when they tell stories later. They jump from betrayal to confrontation because logging is boring and grief is not. But boring is how you survive liars who count on your exhaustion. 3 days later, I was discharged into a rehab plan I could not afford and a house I no longer trusted. I could not drive. I could barely stand long enough to shower. Miriam insisted I come to her unit instead of going home with Talia. Talia fought that by text, by calls, by voice notes where she alternated crying and accusing Miriam of splitting the family. I saved everything. Her messages had a pattern. First, concern. The kids need their dad. Then minimization. It was an insurance admin mix-up. Then pressure. If you keep escalating this, they'll freeze money we need for recovery. Then threat. Lawyers will say you abandoned the home. That last one told me she had already sought legal advice. Or at least Nabil had told her what to say. Miriam's unit was small. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, no lift, 3 flights of stairs I climbed like a man 30 years older than I was. The first night there, I slept on a fold-out bed in the lounge with my leg elevated on sofa cushions while she ate instant noodles at the coffee table and sorted my paperwork into piles. "Mortgage," she said, tapping one stack. "School fees, utilities, insurance, medical." Then she tapped the second stack. "Insurer compliance, hospital records, police event number, your employer HR because they need updated capacity forms." Then she tapped the third stack. "Everything Talia and Nabil send from today." I asked, "What if I'm wrong about intent?" She said, "Then records help everyone. If you're right, records protect you." That was the first quiet decompression scene I had in weeks. And it still ended with a deadline. Insurer compliance wanted a formal written statement by Friday. It was Wednesday night. I spent Thursday on the couch in pain, drafting. Miriam typed because my hands shook and the meds made me miss words. We did not write, "They stole my money." We wrote what we knew: the date and time of accident, hospitalization and period of non-responsiveness, date I regained communication, date I discovered claim emails addressed to my estate, statements made by my wife and brother-in-law regarding filing and use of funds. Work phone message sequence showing attempted insurer login access minutes after the accident. My request for immediate preservation of all claim materials, login records, call recordings, and payout instructions. My request that no funds be considered validly spent on my behalf, pending review. We attached screenshots, not theories. By Friday morning, just insurer compliance called and asked if I could attend an in-person interview once medically able. I said yes and asked for any documents they could share in advance. They sent a limited packet: claim form, beneficiary declaration, supporting hospital status note copy, bank account confirmation, and call log summary. They redacted internal staff names. The claim form was electronically submitted under Talia's beneficiary portal access. Date: the day after the accident. The beneficiary declaration included a statutory statement signed by Talia that, to the best of her knowledge, I had died on the listed date, and she was entitled to the proceeds as nominated beneficiary. Below that was a witness signature: Nabil. He had signed as witness. I printed the packet and spread it on Miriam's coffee table with the phone screenshots, then noticed another contradiction. The bank account receiving the payout was not Talia's usual personal account. It was a joint account ending in 4412. I knew that account. It was the account she shared with Nabil for a small import business she once asked me to invest in, and I refused. I had only seen it because she accidentally left a statement open on the kitchen bench months earlier, and I recognized his name. That was not shock spending for hospital bills. That was routing. I took a photo of the claim packet next to the old screenshot I still had of that account statement from last year. Miriam looked at both and said, "Now we have purpose, not just panic." The first formal collision happened at Insurer Compliance's city office 3 weeks later because they would not conduct the full interview by phone, and I was finally mobile enough, on crutches, slow, exhausted, and furious. Miriam drove me. The office was on level 9 of a glass building with a waiting area that smelled like carpet shampoo and machine coffee. I signed in, sat under bright lights with my rehab brace visible over my pants, and watched Talia and Nabil arrive together 10 minutes later. Talia looked smaller than I remembered, not because she was sorry, but because systems had entered the room. Nabil still looked polished. An investigator named Claire took us into a meeting room with a screen, a speakerphone, and a tray of untouched water glasses. A second man from legal sat in, taking notes. Claire started with ground rules: separate statements, document review, no interruptions, no direct accusations, all remarks recorded. Nabil smiled and said, "Of course." He lasted 18 minutes before interrupting. Claire displayed the claim submission timeline on the screen. Login access initiated from a device associated with Talia's account the afternoon of the accident. Multi-factor authentication attempt. Password reset request. Successful access later that evening. Claim notification opened. Formal claim submitted next morning. Claire asked Talia, "Can you explain the access activity on the day of the accident?" Talia's eyes went to me, then away. I was in shock and trying to understand our finances because doctors said he might not survive. Claire said, "Our records show access attempts before final status communication from the hospital and before death certification." Nabil jumped in. "She was trying to check policies, not file a claim. Families do this." Claire turned to him. "Please let her answer." Then Claire displayed the payout account confirmation. "Ms. Hassan, why was the beneficiary payment directed to the 4412 account?" Talia said, "It was the fastest account available." Claire asked, "Is this your sole account?" Pause. "No." "Who are the joint account holders?" Longer pause. "Me and my brother." The legal note-taker stopped writing for half a second and looked up. Nabil leaned forward. "I manage funds for her because she was overwhelmed." Claire replied, "Were you named beneficiary on the policy?" "No." "Wait. Were you authorized by the policyholder at the time to manage claim proceeds?" No answer. That was the first moment I felt the room turn away from family drama and toward compliance facts. It was not satisfying. It was procedural. That was better. Then came the setback. Claire asked me, "Mr. Hassan, had you at any time discussed with your wife that, In the event of severe incapacity, she should access policy funds for household expenses. I said yes. We had discussed emergency planning broadly: mortgage, kids, living expenses. That was true. Nabil latched onto that instantly. Exactly. He's confirming intent. Claire held up a hand. Intent in a hypothetical bereavement context is not the same as entitlement after an erroneous death claim. We are establishing facts. Still, it complicated my position because I could no longer present this as if no one had ever discussed emergency money. We had, like many families do. The issue was false status, premature claim filing, routing to a joint sibling account, and spending before verification. Real cases get messier when honest facts coexist with bad conduct. The interview ran nearly 3 hours. I left with my back in spasm and sweat down my shirt. In the lift lobby, Talia tried to speak to me alone while Miriam was getting the car. Dan, please, Nabil pushed things. I was terrified. We can fix this if you stop treating me like a criminal. I leaned on my crutch and said, how much did you spend? Tears again, immediate. I don't know exactly. How much? She whispered. Most of it is committed. Committed to what? She looked over her shoulder like someone might hear. Please don't make me say this here. I said, then send a full transaction list by tonight. She nodded like she agreed. At 11:52 p.m., she emailed a spreadsheet. It was one of the most insulting documents I have ever seen. No bank export, no statements. Just a homemade spreadsheet with rounded figures and vague labels. Medical reserve, children future, debt support, business obligation, family loan, cash withdrawal, urgent transfers. Nearly $400,000 listed as allocated with no receipts. One line for $95,000 labeled property hold deposit. Another for $62,000 labeled Nabil reimbursement. Miriam read it over my shoulder and said she sent fiction in columns. But it was still useful because it contained admissions. Nabil reimbursement meant she was no longer saying he merely helped. Property hold deposit meant they tried to park funds somewhere. I emailed back a one-line response copying Claire at compliance. This is not a verifiable transaction record. Please provide bank statements, transfer confirmations, and supporting documents. No answer that night. The next pressure source arrived from somewhere I should have seen coming. My employer's income protection insurer, because I'd been out of work after a major accident. I filed an income protection claim through my super policy. 2 weeks into that process, I got a request for clarification due to discrepancies in reported financial circumstances and external notifications. Someone had told them I'd received a substantial insurance payout and therefore might not meet benefit criteria. I read the letter at Miriam's kitchen table and laughed once, sharply, because it was almost efficient. If Talia and Nabil couldn't keep the life payout clean, the existence of that payout could still be used to choke my recovery income. The consequence was plain. Rehab appointments, rent, and groceries depended on that income protection approval. I called the case manager and explained with dates that a life policy had been erroneously paid under a death claim while I was hospitalized, that the payout was under dispute and not in my control, and that I was cooperating with an active insurer compliance review. The case manager asked for evidence. By then, I had it. Claim emails, compliance acknowledgement, interview notice. My statement. I sent a tight pack. He thanked me and said, "This is unusual." That phrase followed me for months. By the time my mobility improved enough to return briefly to the family house to collect more clothes and records, the place felt staged. Talia had cleaned everything. Too clean. Surfaces empty, drawers reorganized, documents gone from the home office filing cabinet where we kept policy paperwork and tax records. She said she was decluttering after trauma. I asked for the filing folders. She said, I put important things in storage so the kids wouldn't get into them. Where? At Mum's, her mother's house. Another delay point. I did not fight in front of the kids. That was a rule I set for myself early. And it cost me leverage in the moment, but saved me later when everyone started rewriting who brought conflict into the home. Instead, I walked through the study slowly and photographed the empty drawer rails, the missing file labels, and the lockbox shelf where my old passport and policy copies had been. In the kitchen on top of the fridge, I found a crumpled courier envelope with the insurer logo and a printed remittance advice stub torn in half. Ignored proof item number 3. It had part of the payout reference and the date stamp. Talia saw me looking at it and said, "Too fast. That's old." I put it in my bag. At the door, my son, 7 years old, hair sticking up from a nap, hugged my leg brace and asked, "Dad, are you dead on paper?" I went completely still. Kids hear everything. They don't understand categories, so they repeat the sentence that made the adults go quiet. Talia was across the room in 2 steps. "No, sweetheart, that's not what we said." "Hey." He looked up at me and whispered, "Uncle Nabil told Nana you came back and made everything hard." I did not answer him. I kissed his head, told him I loved him, and sat in the car outside afterward, shaking so hard Miriam had to take the wheel home. That was the damage no spreadsheet could calculate. The first clear win came from a document, not a confrontation. 6 weeks after the compliance interview, Claire sent a formal notice. The insurer had determined the death claim was invalid due to erroneous status reliance and material non-disclosure in the beneficiary declaration process. They were initiating recovery action for the full payout, plus tracing of disbursed funds, and had referred aspects of the matter for fraud review. They would also compensate me for direct out-of-pocket costs tied to claim remediation delays, subject to evidence. They did not call me a victim in dramatic language. They stated findings and actions. I printed the notice and sat with it for a long time. It was not money back in my account. It was not accountability completed. But it was institutional recognition that I had not imagined this. Talia called within an hour. "How could you let them do this?" she said, voice thin and furious. "They're freezing accounts. Nabil can't pay staff." I almost missed the admission because of how absurd the sentence was. "Staff?" I said. Silence. Then, "You know what I mean." "No, I don't. Why is my life policy in your brother's business cash flow?" She started crying, then switched to anger. "You care more about being right than what this does to the children." I said, "Send me a proposal through a lawyer." She hung up. That evening, Nabil sent a message from a private number, no greeting. "You've gone too far. Recovery action can be negotiated if you stop talking. Claire is overreaching. Call me." I sent it straight to Claire and Ms. Patel. The solicitor Miriam had helped me hire on a payment plan after the first consultation. Ms. Patel's response was simple. "Do not call him. Preserve the message." She was not theatrical. She was efficient, which was exactly what I needed. Then came the apology attempt dressed as mediation. A family elder from Talia's side, her uncle Yusuf, requested a meeting to restore dignity and avoid court. He was respected, retired, and usually called when people wanted a quiet settlement without records. I agreed only if the meeting was at Ms. Patel's office and notes were taken. He resisted that at first. "This is family, Habibi, not litigation." I said, "It became litigation when they filed my death claim while I was alive." We met anyway, in a small conference room with a chipped laminate table and a jug of water no one touched. Talia came. Nabil came. Uncle Yusuf came. Ms. Patel came. Miriam sat behind me with a folder. Talia opened with, "I never wanted harm. I was panicking." But I believed the panic part. I did not let it replace the facts. Nabil tried business language again. "There were liquidity movements under emergency assumptions. We can unwind this cooperatively." Ms. Patel asked, "Please define liquidity movements in figures and identify which movements were personal, business-related, and third-party transfers." He looked annoyed. "We don't have all that here." Miriam slid a printout across the table, Talia's homemade spreadsheet, highlighted. "Then what is this?" she asked. He didn't touch it. Uncle Yusuf tried to move us toward forgiveness language. "Mistakes happened under stress. The priority now is peace." I said, "Peace requires actions." Then I laid out the conditions, not because I was performing strength, but because the insurer recovery process and family pressure made vague reconciliation dangerous. Full bank statements and transaction records for every account that received or moved payout funds. No direct contact with my employer, insurers, or rehab providers. Written retraction to any third party who had been told I was lying or exploiting the accident. Cooperation with insurer recovery and tracing requests, including disclosure of any property deposits or business transfers funded by the payout. A parenting schedule in writing through lawyers only, while my physical recovery was ongoing. A family communication rule that no one discussed dad dying or paper death with the children. Nabil smirked. "You think you're a prosecutor now?" I said, "No, I'm done negotiating with missing records." That room did not produce peace. It produced minutes, which was better. The second wave hit 2 weeks later, exactly when I thought the worst of it had passed. My income protection claim was approved in principle. then delayed again because the Superfund's compliance unit opened a separate review after seeing the insurer fraud referral reference in my documents. Different system, different staff. Same problem. Once your file is marked unusual, every process slows. The letter said, payments were temporarily paused pending verification of financial benefit overlap and potential undisclosed recoveries. I read it on a plastic chair in a rehab waiting room while other patients did shoulder exercises in front of mirrors. My physio called my name. I couldn't move. That was the breaking point location for me. Not the crash site, not the compliance office, but a rehab clinic waiting room where I realized surviving the accident had become a full-time administrative job. And I was losing wages while proving I was alive, proving I hadn't benefited, proving I wasn't complicit, and proving I still qualified for support after money I never controlled had been spent in my name. I went into the accessible bathroom, locked the door, and sat on the closed lid, shaking with pain and anger until Miriam arrived. She had left a night shift early because I sent her a photo of the letter with no caption. She sat on the floor outside the stall door while I read the letter out loud through it. Then she said, "Same method. Build a packet once, reuse it." So we did. Late that night, at her kitchen table, receipts and letters spread under a yellow lamp, we built the Benefit Overlap Clarification Pack. It included the Life Insurer Invalid Claim Notice, Compliance Recovery Action Notice, my statement confirming no access to payout funds, evidence of disputed control, legal correspondence, and a short timeline showing I had incurred direct costs while funds were routed elsewhere. Miriam added tabs. Ms. Patel reviewed wording. My physio wrote a brief letter confirming treatment delays would risk recovery progression if income support was interrupted. It was 1:40 a.m. when we finished. My brace was off. My leg was swollen. Miriam was eating cold toast over the sink. I looked at the table and realized this is what endurance looks like in real life. Not speeches, just folders, painkillers, and repeated explanations to systems that didn't design for your exact kind of disaster. At 8:12 the next morning, I sent the packet. By noon, the compliance reviewer asked for a call. That was where part one ends for me, because by then the pattern was fully exposed and the outcome was no longer about whether they had done it. It was about whether I could stay disciplined long enough to outlast the systems, the smears, the delays, and the family pressure without losing my health, my kids, or the record. They spent my life insurance. While I was still alive, surviving that accident became their worst nightmare. Part two. The compliance reviewer from the Superfund called at 12:37 p.m. while I was still in the same rehab clinic waiting room with my brace pressing into my ribs and my physio pretending not to watch me unravel. Her name was Janine. Her voice was precise and tired, in the way people sound when they've spent years reading files where nobody tells the truth in the same order twice. "I've read your packet," she said. "This is unusually well documented." I almost laughed because I had not slept properly in months, and my sister had built half that packet on cold toast in spite. Janine kept going. "I need 3 things today if you can provide them. Written confirmation from the life insurer that the death benefit remains under recovery action and not available to you. Any evidence that payments were routed to third-party business accounts, and confirmation of your current household living arrangements." There it was. Another system. Another threshold, another version of the same question. Are you actually in financial need, or are you hiding money? I said, yes, I can send all of that. What I did not say was that obtaining confirmation from one insurer for another insurer's compliance timeline was exactly the kind of administrative crossfire that breaks people who don't have backup, time, or witness. If Miriam had not trained herself into my accidental case manager, I would have missed deadlines simply because pain meds make paperwork feel like fog. I called Claire at the life insurer from the car park while Miriam loaded my crutches into the boot. She answered on the 3rd ring and said, "Mr. Hassan, I was about to call you." For 1 second, my stomach dropped because when investigators say that, it is rarely good news. Then she said, "We've obtained partial banking records through recovery demands. There are additional transfers we did not have at interview." I leaned against the car and closed my eyes. How bad? Claire was careful with wording. "I can't share full tracing details yet, but I can provide a letter confirming the invalid claim determination, active recovery action, and that disputed proceeds are not under your control. Please include that they were dispersed to an account I'm not a holder on. I can include that the beneficiary payout was made to the nominated beneficiary's supplied account and is subject to recovery tracing." I cannot identify all account holders in a third-party confirmation letter. Fair. Annoying, but fair. I said yes and thanked her, and then she added the line that changed the next month. There is also a concern regarding a secondary policy. I straightened up so fast my pelvis screamed. What secondary policy? An accidental death rider attached to your employer group cover. A notification was initiated but not completed. It appears to have been abandoned when your status was corrected. I stared at the clinic brick wall. Nabil hadn't just moved on one policy. He had checked for another. Claire could hear the silence. I thought you should know because it may affect your Superfund file if they see cross-references. That was the second wave inside the second wave. It was not enough that they had filed and spent one payout. They had started probing adjacent coverage while I was in ICU. I wrote it down on the back of a physio appointment slip because my hands were shaking too hard to open notes. By 4 p.m. Janine had Claire's letter, my lease copy showing I was temporarily living with Miriam, and a statutory declaration from me confirming I had no access to life insurance proceeds and was incurring direct recovery costs while the disputed funds were under investigation. At 5:26 p.m., she emailed that my income protection payments would be released pending final review, with back pay for the paused period. It was not a heroic message. It was 6 lines and a PDF. I cried anyway, quietly, at Miriam's kitchen table while she pretended to focus on chopping onions. The money did not solve everything. It did keep rehab going. It paid for fuel, meds, physio gaps, and the lawyer installments that were eating me alive. In real life, justice often arrives looking like cash flow restored. That same week, Ms. Patel sent the first serious procedural letter that made Nabil stop acting like a cousin in a loud family argument and start acting like a person with exposure. She wrote to his solicitor, not him. She referenced the insurer's invalid claim and recovery action, requested preservation of all records relating to the payout, identified the apparent use of proceeds in accounts and transactions beyond household emergency expenses, and demanded disclosure of any property deposits, business obligations, or third-party transfers funded in whole or part by the payout. Then she added one line I read 3 times. Please confirm your client has taken immediate steps to prevent dissipation of traceable funds. Dissipation, not spending, not mistakes. Dissipation. Language matters because it tells people what category they are in. The response from Nabil's solicitor arrived 2 days later and did exactly what I expected. Deny wrongdoing, deny intent, deny misrepresentation beyond reasonable reliance on erroneous medical information, and accuse me of causing reputational harm by making inflamed allegations. They also tried to box the issue into a private family dispute and suggested mediation without prejudice before any further public-facing actions. Public-facing actions. I hadn't posted anything. I hadn't spoken to media. I hadn't blasted family chats. Their panic was about institutions talking to each other now. Insurer, Superfund, hospital review, lawyers. Ms. Patel called me after reading it and said, "This is good." I was lying on Miriam's couch with an ice pack on my hip and said, "How is this good?" They denied the wrong thing, she said. They're arguing intent and reputation. We're arguing records and tracing. That sentence snapped me back into the right frame. If I let myself get dragged into proving they were evil, I'd lose time and clarity. I needed to prove sequence, access, declarations, routing, spending, and harm. The hospital review report arrived the following week, and it was exactly as bureaucratic as I feared and exactly as useful as I hoped. No dramatic confession, no names, no sweeping fault admission. It found that an erroneous deceased status flag had been entered in a linked administrative system during interfacility transfer, that the flag was corrected after clinical confirmation, and that internal escalation protocols were not consistently followed regarding downstream data visibility. It also said an external inquiry log existed showing a family member had contacted administration seeking status confirmation while records were unstable. The report did not state the hospital directly told anyone to file insurance claims. It did state there was a communication control failure during a critical window. That mattered because it prevented the entire case from being reduced to family fraud or hospital error. It was both. A systems failure created an opening. People then used that opening in ways that triggered a different category of accountability. Ross, the administrator, called me after the report was issued and used the phrase "deeply regrettable" twice. Then he said the hospital was introducing a restricted status protocol for unverified death flags and additional staff training for administrative escalation during transfer incidents. That was the first policy shift tied to what happened to me. I asked for written confirmation of the protocol changes and training timeline. He paused for half a second and then said, "Yes, I can provide a summary." By then, people had started expecting that question from me. The family side got uglier before it got cleaner. Talia filed for interim parenting orders, not full custody, not at first. Stability-based interim arrangements citing my recovery limitations and high-conflict financial behavior as stressors to the children. The filing described me as preoccupied with litigation, emotionally volatile after trauma, and unable to provide consistent physical care due to mobility restrictions. There is no clean way to describe what it feels like to read your injuries, your administrative fight, and your refusal to ignore an invalid death payout repackaged as evidence you are the unstable one. I read the application in Ms. Patel's office and felt a familiar heat in my teeth, the same one I felt when my son asked if I was dead on paper. But this time, I had a better file. We responded with rehab reports, income support records, a proposed parenting schedule tied to my physical limitations and treatment times, school pickup support from Miriam and a neighbor, and a chronology showing I had consistently avoided arguing in front of the children and had requested written communication. We also attached selected messages from Talia using the children as leverage and threatening legal narratives around abandonment of the home. No speeches, just contradictions. The interim hearing was in a packed family court list room where everyone looked tired and underdressed for the seriousness of what they were carrying. Prams, folders, cheap coffee, people whispering with legal aid lawyers in hallways. It smelled like stress and printer paper. Talia arrived with counsel and a face I knew well, controlled grief. Nabil was there too, sitting 3 rows back, pretending this was about child stability and not the fact that family court affidavits create records under oath. When our matter was called, the registrar cut through the performance fast. She looked at my brace, looked at the competing proposals, but looked at the messages and said, "The father's injuries are temporary. The financial dispute is separate from parenting except where communication affects the children. I am not making children the currency of an insurance conflict." I wrote that line down too. She ordered interim shared time on a structured schedule, child communication boundaries, and use of a parenting app for all logistics. She also directed both parties not to discuss legal or insurance disputes with the children and warned that involving extended family and narratives about the other parent would be taken seriously. It was not a total win. I wanted more time immediately. My body couldn't handle it yet anyway, and pretending otherwise would have hurt me later. So I took the structured schedule and the parenting app because apps produce logs, and logs outlive lies. Outside court, Talia tried another version of apology. "I didn't want it to come to this," she said quietly, while our lawyers were speaking near the elevators. Nabil made everything bigger. I looked at her and for the first time believed she might be telling part of the truth. Then I said, "If that's true, stop protecting him in documents." She stared at me like she didn't know how to answer a sentence that demanded action instead of emotion. The insurer recovery action escalated in the background, while family court burned time and money in the foreground. Claire's team traced portions of the payout into the joint account, then into a property deposit account, then into multiple outgoing transfers. One of them was to a payroll service tied to Nabil's import business. Another was a lump sum marked as repayment to a private lender. Another was cash withdrawals. Some funds appear to have paid actual household expenses connected to our mortgage and school fees, which complicated everything, but did not legitimize the routing or declaration conduct. The key point was this: the money was not sitting there waiting to be returned once things calmed down. It had been used as if my death payout was operating capital. When Miss Patel explained tracing to me, she said, "Recovery doesn't depend on every dollar being untouched. It depends on records, recipients, and legal responsibility." That sentence got me through a lot of nights. The first actual restitution to me came in pieces. Not one dramatic transfer. The life insurer reimbursed documented remediation costs, travel to compliance interviews, legal outlays tied directly to claim correction, replacement of some records, and certain rehab delays supported by evidence. It was not generous. It was exact. I appreciated that. They also confirmed in writing that my policy remained active, subject to administrative correction and beneficiary review. That last part mattered more than people realize. For months, I had been living in the absurd space where I was both alive and functionally closed out in one insurer system. Record restoration is a form of dignity. The beneficiary review opened another war. I changed my beneficiary nomination after separation proceedings started, through proper legal advice and notice. Talia's solicitor challenged the timing, implying retaliation and marital asset maneuvering. The insurer froze processing pending legal clarification because once a file has been contaminated by fraud review and family litigation, nobody wants to be the next person blamed for pressing approve. This was the technicality pressure the story had been training me for without me knowing it. I had won recognition, triggered recovery, protected my income support, and still hit a system delay on something as basic as updating my own life policy because the file now carried too much heat. I wanted to scream. Ms. Patel shrugged and said, "We file the clarification." So we filed the clarification. Separation date. Interim parenting orders. Ongoing proceedings. No restriction on nomination change under the policy terms. No consent requirement. No asset distribution prejudice because life cover nomination is not the same as immediate divisible cash. Attach orders. Attach insurer's own beneficiary rules. Request processing timeline. It took 23 days. 23 days is not dramatic unless you are the person waiting to know whether the same system that paid your death benefit while you were alive can now correctly record who receives it if you die for real. During those 23 days, I met the optional next-generation mirror in the strangest way. At physio, a younger guy named Corey, maybe 22, forklift injury, arm in a sling, all restless energy, recognized my name from a local community thread where people had been vaguely discussing a paper death insurance mess. I braced for gossip. Instead, he said, My mom's partner keeps doing paperwork for her when she's on meds. You got any advice?" We were standing by resistance bands and foam rollers. Not exactly a mentorship setting. I said, "Photograph everything she signs. Keep dates. Don't accuse first. Ask for copies in writing. If they refuse, write down the refusal, and get one neutral witness in the room if you can." He nodded like I'd handed him a tool, not a speech. A month later, he told me he got a community legal worker involved before a refinance document was signed. That conversation steadied me more than I expected. It made the whole thing feel less like private ruin and more like something that could interrupt a pattern. The hospital policy change became public in a quiet way, not media. No headlines. A quality and safety bulletin circulated to staff and affiliated services. And then a brief mention at a patient advisory meeting I was invited to attend after Ross learned I had filed a formal feedback submission instead of a compensation demand at that stage. I went because if they were going to use words like learning opportunity, I wanted to hear what exactly they learned. The meeting room had stale muffins and a projector that hummed too loud. Ross presented a slide on status verification controls during transfer incidents. He did not name me, but he described a case where an erroneous deceased flag contributed to downstream external confusion and significant harm. He listed the new requirements: dual verification before external administrative status release, restricted visibility coding for unconfirmed death entries, audit logs on status changes, and staff refresher training. Afterward, he asked if I wanted to say anything. I said, "Documentation delays cost patients differently depending on what other systems are attached to their lives. Please train staff to think beyond the chart." The room went quiet in the useful way where people are writing. Well, that was an accountability moment I did not expect when this began. Not revenge, process repair. The criminal/fraud referral side moved slower than everything else. And I need to be honest about that, because people tell these stories like the police knock the next morning and cuff the obvious villain. They don't. Financial investigations move like old elevators unless there is immediate flight risk or massive organized fraud. This was a messy hybrid of hospital error, beneficiary access, disputed intent, and family relationships. It took statements, records, tracing, and legal sorting before anyone used hard labels. What did move faster was pressure. Once Nabil's business accounts were touched by recovery tracing, and one property deposit was flagged in a dispute chain, his tone changed. The polished confidence thinned. He stopped sending direct messages. He stopped appearing at family court. His solicitor became harder to reach, which in legal disputes usually means the client is either out of money, out of patience, or both. Then came the damage control attempt in public. A mutual family friend sent Miriam screenshots from a WhatsApp community group where Nabil posted a vague message about false allegations during a tragic family medical event and opportunistic people trying to profit from confusion. No names, but everyone in that circle knew. Old me would have typed a paragraph and detonated it. Current me sent the screenshots to Ms. Patel and asked, "Respond or archive?" She wrote back, "Archive first. If repeated, we act." It repeated, 2 more messages, one from Nabil and one from a cousin amplifying his version, both implying I was weaponizing an accident and chasing money from family who cared for me. The second message referenced his own insurer issues, as if I had caused the invalid death payout, Ms. Patel then sent a defamation concerns letter, narrow and ugly in the best way, identifying the posts, preserving rights, and demanding immediate deletion, non-republication, and correction of any statements alleging I fabricated or profiteered from the claim invalidation process. By evening, the posts were gone. By the next afternoon, the same mutual friend sent a screenshot of Nabil in the group saying, "Out of respect for the children, I won't discuss private legal matters further." That sentence was not an apology. It was retreat dressed as dignity. I accepted it. The insurer recovery outcomes were finalized in stages over the next 6 months. Some funds were recovered directly from accounts, some through negotiated repayment structures. Some became liabilities on paper that would outlast the immediate crisis. I never got a dramatic scene where someone slid a check across a table and admitted everything. Real accountability looked like legal obligations, tracing reports, settlement terms, and people suddenly becoming very precise about dates. Talia eventually changed solicitors. That mattered because her new lawyer stopped writing like Nabil's business partner and started writing like someone who had read the full file. The tone shifted from denial and blame to containment and resolution. Parenting communications improved. Financial disclosures in family law became less theatrical and more complete. She still minimized her role in the insurance claim whenever she could, but the broad story, that she was just a panicked spouse entirely manipulated by others, stopped surviving contact with documents. We had one private conversation that I still think about. It was in a supervised handover car park after my brace was off, but I still walked stiff. Rain on the roof, kids in the back seat arguing over a snack. She stood by my window and said, "I didn't think you'd survive." I looked at her and said, "That doesn't explain what happened after you knew I did." She cried quietly, not performative this time, just tired. By then it was already moving. Nabil said if I told the truth immediately, we'd lose everything and you'd blame me anyway. I said, "I did lose everything, just slower." She nodded like she knew that was fair. Then she said, "What do you want from me now?" By then, I had learned the difference between impossible answers and enforceable ones. I said, "Accurate records, no lies around the kids, follow orders, stop letting him speak for you." She wiped her face and said, "I can do some of that." It was not redemption. It was a realistic sentence. I took it. The final formal accountability piece I pushed for was one people kept telling me to drop because I was already getting enough. Jimayo. I wanted the insurer to document procedural corrections in my file and provide a written record restoration statement I could use if future underwriting, super reviews, or claims teams saw the prior invalid death claim history and treated me like a problem file. Once a system labels you unusual, that label travels. Claire understood immediately. Her team issued a formal confirmation stating that the prior death claim was determined invalid, that the payout had been subject to recovery action due to erroneous status and claim process concerns, that I was not the submitting claimant, and that my policyholder record had been restored with notations to prevent adverse treatment arising solely from the incident history. They also confirmed internal process changes linked to lessons from the case, while without naming staff disciplines or confidential outcomes. That letter may be the most valuable document I got out of the entire mess, because lawsuits end, family fights go quiet, files remain. My employer situation stabilized too, but only because I pushed for a practical fix instead of just being grateful they hadn't fired me. I asked HR to place a confidential note on my record documenting that malicious third-party contact had occurred during an active family/legal dispute, and that performance issues in the immediate post-accident period had been medically supported, not misconduct. I also asked that any future external complaints about my mental instability be escalated through HR review rather than informal supervisor handling. Sonia backed that request without hesitation. HR agreed, after one meeting and a lot of careful wording. That was a quiet win no one sees in a story unless they've had their livelihood brushed by someone else's smear campaign. The children adjusted slower than any legal process. Plus, my son stopped asking if I was dead on paper after a child psychologist helped us build simpler language. Dad got hurt. Adults made serious paperwork mistakes. Courts and companies are fixing them. None of this is your job. We repeated versions of that for months. My daughter, older and quieter, asked better questions. Why did adults say things that weren't true? There is no clean answer for that one without poisoning them against half their family. I settled on, some people panic and make it worse. Some people protect themselves the wrong way. Our job is to tell the truth and follow rules. I don't know if that's enough. It was what I could stand to live with. The quiet decompression scene that told me I was finally through the worst of it happened in a place I never used to notice, a supermarket car park at dusk. I had finished a physio session, picked up groceries myself without timing pain meds around the trip, and loaded 2 bags into my own car. Not a borrowed car, mine, repaired. Ugly, functional. I sat behind the wheel and realized there were no compliance calls due that week, no court filing deadline that night, no urgent packet to assemble, no letter draft waiting on my laptop, just groceries sweating in the passenger footwell and my phone face down. I called Miriam anyway. She answered on speaker and said, "What happened?" "Nothing," I said. "That's the point." She was quiet for a second, then laughed. "Buy yourself something stupid then. Celebrate." I bought a decent coffee on the way home instead of instant. That was my celebration. People ask me now, when they hear some version of this story, whether it was worth it. They usually mean the money. The money mattered. Of course it mattered. It was life insurance I paid for, routed, and spent while I was alive and unable to defend myself. A recovery action and tracing were necessary. But if you ask only about money, you miss what nearly got taken with it. My record, my credibility, my parenting position, my recovery income. My ability to move through systems without being treated like the source of the irregularity. My children's trust in basic facts. What I won was not a revenge fantasy. I did not destroy anyone. I did not get a perfect confession. I did not walk away untouched. I won through endurance and receipts. I won because Miriam wrote timelines when I couldn't hold a pen steady. Because Claire treated sequence like evidence instead of family noise. Because Janine at the Superfund actually read the packet. Because Ms. Patel responded to posturing with definitions and demands. Because Sonia documented malicious contact instead of whispering about me in the break room. Because a registrar in a crowded list room refused to let children become leverage. Because I stopped trying to win arguments and started building records. Nabil's business shrank after the recovery process and related account pressures. I don't know every consequence, and I do not need to. Talia and I finalized parenting and financial arrangements through a long, expensive process that left both of us poorer and more careful. She remains the mother of my children. That fact requires a kind of discipline no courtroom teaches. I still carry scars in my ribs when the weather changes. I still get a flash of heat when an insurer puts me on hold too long. I still back up documents in 3 places. And yes, I still ask for everything in writing. I also review every policy I hold now with a level of attention I should have had earlier. Beneficiary nominations, portal access, 2-factor authentication, emergency contacts, who can speak to whom, what happens if I'm incapacitated but not dead. I do not treat that as paranoia anymore. I treat it as maintenance. Months after the major recovery actions were underway, the hospital invited patient representatives to a training session for admin staff on status verification protocol. Ross asked if I would allow an anonymized version of my case to be used in a scenario exercise. I said yes on one condition. Include the downstream effects beyond hospital walls, insurance, employment, family court, rehabilitation delays. He agreed. I sat at the back of that room and watched clerks and coordinators work through a simulation where one wrong flag created a chain of harm none of them had intended. They took it seriously. That mattered. After the session, a young admin worker came up to me and said, "I used to think status coding errors were just data cleanup. I won't think that again." That sentence landed harder than any family apology I received. If there is one thing I would force into every version of this story, it is this. The worst part was not the crash. The crash was physics. The worst part was waking up into a paper world already moving without me and realizing survival was only the beginning of the work. Surviving became their problem because I was able to speak, yes, but it became their worst nightmare because I learned to document better than they could improvise. And once the file exists, the story stops belonging to the loudest person in the room. January 14th, 2026. Life insurer confirmed the death claim was invalid and opened formal recovery action and tracing on disputed proceeds. January 22nd, 2026. Income protection payments were released with back pay after compliance review, accepted documentation that disputed life insurance funds were not under my control. February 2026. Hospital review finalized findings on erroneous deceased status flag handling and communication control failures during transfer, with protocol changes initiated. March 8, 2026. Interim parenting orders established a structured schedule, app-based communication, and restrictions on discussing legal/insurance disputes with the children. March to August 2026. Recovery tracing identified transfers into joint and third-party accounts, including business-linked disbursements and a property-related deposit chain. April 2026. Employer HR documented malicious third-party complaint activity and implemented escalation handling for future external allegations tied to the dispute. May 2026. Insurer issued record restoration confirmation noting I was not the submitting claimant and preventing adverse treatment based solely on the invalid claim history. Ongoing through late 2026, policy, beneficiary, and access controls were updated across my accounts. Parenting and financial matters continued under documented channels and legal oversight. If this moved you, don't just watch, act. Review your insurance beneficiaries, portal access, and two-factor settings before a crisis. Document incidents early with timestamps, screenshots, and exact wording. Push for written corrections and procedural safeguards, not verbal reassurance. Support local legal aid and community services that help people navigate fraud, family coercion, and administrative harm.